Welcome to Macenta University. Macenta is an innovative, secure, and easy-to-use platform that empowers sourcing teams to deliver breakthrough results. In this tutorial, I'll be covering agreement resources. Essentially, resources represent a link between your agreements and the real world. They can be anything that your agreements need to refer to externally, like machines, tools, materials, labor, and data. In legal terms, these external elements are usually found in the schedules or appendices section of your contracts and are considered to be a substantive part of the definitive agreement itself. While it's obviously useful to be able to catalog external elements, the primary reason for needing resources in Macenta is because they can be used within your agreements to configure your products and to ultimately determine their selling prices. I hope you can see now why resources are very important in Macenta. You will be pleased to hear that unlike some of the other tutorials that I've done recently, this one is going to be lighter on theory and heavier on demonstrations. It's also going to be a bit shorter, I promise. I'm going to divide this tutorial into just 2 sections. In the first section, I'll define resources, types, attributes, and items. In the second half, I'll cover the usage of resources in the cost structure and product costing, then finally in legal text. Following the usual format, I'll first go through the theory, and then my colleague, Natasha, will put it into practice by showing you how it works in the portal. Before we get into the tutorial, here's what you need to get started. First, you'll need to register your organization with Macenta from our marketing page, located at www.macenta.com. We have a tutorial on this channel on how to do that if you need any help. If you're new to Macenta, you should view our tutorial on using our portal, as well as all the introductory tutorials on configuring your account if you're the organization administrator. For demonstration purposes, I registered a fictional organization called Saturn Corporation with a single manufacturing site, located in Thailand. I've set the subdomain that we will be using to access our portal at saturn.macenta.com. Of course, your organization's subdomain will be different. In order to prepare for this tutorial, I've created a proposal for a new agreement with a fake counterparty, Acme. I've also added products from the buying party, Saturn, to the agreement. Because resources play a central role in agreements, they touch many different features of the application. If you're watching this tutorial from the playlist, then you're good to go, otherwise these are the areas you'll need to be familiar with. It's not necessary that you fully understand agreements and proposals for this session, but you should be familiar with agreement cost structures and understand how formulas in cost items work in calculating the product costs. We're also going to demonstrate defining attributes for the resources that we create, so you should be comfortable with attributes in Macenta. Another area that I'll touch on is using resources in legal text. Unless your role includes drafting contracts, you won't be expected to be able to understand our templating language. If there are any gaps in your knowledge, all these topics are covered in other tutorials also on this channel. I suggest you view them first, before returning. Finally, you'll need to make sure that you're authorized to perform the actions required. Natasha has been granted administrator access to the resource module and manager access for the other entities. Before I go on, there is an important housekeeping matter to mention. Natasha and I will be touching on various legal topics, including the setup of a fictitious agreement. None of us are lawyers, nor does Macenta provide any legal services. Therefore, nothing in this tutorial should be interpreted as constituting legal advice. Please read and accept Macenta's disclaimer in the description of this video before continuing. Right, let's jump in. In Macenta, resources represent the definition of the external element. When you define a resource, you'll be expected to provide its name, description, type, and custom attributes. The resources items, on the other hand, represent the actual physical instances of the resource. Let me give you an example. Suppose you define a resource called injection molding machine. You could also define the attributes that these machines might have, such as its size, maximum shot volume, and injection technology. The items then represent the actual physical machines, such as a 75-ton and a 100-ton machine at the supplier's site. For each of these items, values would need to be provided for the attributes. So for example, the first machine might be hydraulic and the second might be electric, and so on. I think I've said enough about how to define resources. I'll hand you over to Natasha, who will demonstrate what we just learned.
We've got a lot to cover in this first demonstration. First, I'll show you where the resource menus are located in the agreement module. Then we'll maintain the resource types, create resources and define custom attributes. Once we've done that, I'll show you how to add items to the resource and set its values. I've signed into the portal and landed on our homepage. For this demo, I'm using version 0.9 of the software. In these beta releases, we've been making a lot of changes, so your version might look a little different. I'll update the tutorial if the changes are anything more than aesthetic. In preparation for this demonstration, I've created a proposal for a fictitious plastic parts agreement with a supplier called Acme. Let's view that proposal now by clicking Agreements on the main menu, and then click the only proposal listed, which is the one that I just created. When the proposal menu loads, notice that the Resources menu is located in the Agreement section. I'll click Resources now. At the top of the Resource menu, there is a listing of resource types which Macenta pre-populates for you when you create a proposal. This list is quite comprehensive, so you'll probably never touch it, except to remove the types you won't need. But if you decide to create a new type, click the plus icon in the section header and input a name. Like all names in Macenta, it should be unique and less than 50 characters in length. When you click Save, the form will open, where you'll be able to provide more details. To remove a type, click the Remove button, and then confirm your decision. You can remove types only if they are not used by a resource. The next section that we'll look at are the resources. But first, I'll collapse the Types menu to give us more room to concentrate on the resources. Click the plus icon in the section heading. The first resource that we will create is the injection molding machine. I'll choose Machine from the list of types which I mentioned earlier. Resource types are currently only used for reporting and classification purposes. Once the resource is created, Macenta will open the Resources menu. You can view the resource's properties by clicking Properties in the Configuration section. I'll do that and then input a more helpful description. Once that's done, I'll add two custom attributes for the resource. First, an attribute for the clamping force in tons, and second, the contractual price in dollars per hour that the supplier quotes to inject the parts. I'm going quickly here since defining attributes is already covered in other tutorials. Now that I've created the resource and defined its attributes, it's time to add its items, which are the actual machines in the supplier's inventory. Usually, the supplier would do this, but I'll do that now for expediency. Anyway, the supplier can easily amend this list by simply making the changes and submitting the proposal for approval. The beauty of Macenta Smart Agreements is that amendments become almost trivial. The first injection molding machine that I'll add is a 75-ton Haiqian machine. Once the item is saved, Macenta will automatically open the edit form. The first thing you should see is that the attributes which we defined earlier are listed here. I'll provide values for them, along with a description. Next, I'll add a 100-ton Toshiba machine. I'm going a little faster now because you've seen me do this already. And then I'll add a 160-ton Engel machine. 3 machines is enough for now. The next resource that I'll create represents the molds used by the machines. Again, click the plus icon in the section header and key in a unique name. This time, I'll select tooling from the list of resource types. The molds will have 3 attributes. First, an attribute for the number of cavities measured in each per mold cycle. Second, an attribute for the cycle time of the mold in seconds per mold cycle. And finally, an attribute for the total shot weight in grams per mold cycle. Notice that all these units are per mold cycle, so we'll have to divide by the number of cavities to get per each when we build the formula later. Now that the resource is defined, let's add an item. As we did before, click the plus icon in the section header and then key in a name. When the edit form loads, notice again that our attributes are listed. I'll input some values for these attributes and save my changes. I'll stop here because I want to show you later what happens when there is only one item. The final resource that I will create will be for the resin. This time, I'll select a material type. When the resource menu loads, I'll add 2 attributes. The first will be the grade or type of resin, and the second will be the landed price of the resin in dollars per kilogram. Next, let's add the resins that our supplier will be using. First ABS and then nylon. In real agreements, you'd need to set up a way to handle master batches and compounds, but for this demo, let's just assume we're using virgin resin. That completes the first demo. I'll see you again shortly when we use the resources that we just created.
Thanks, Natasha. Before we talk about using resources in the cost structure, I'll give you a quick refresher on how costing works in Macenta. In Macenta Smart Agreements, the cost structure represents the agreed upon method that the selling prices of the products will be determined. A cost structure is a hierarchical arrangement of cost items, each containing a formula which determines how the cost item's value should be calculated. Each formula item has a math operator and references an attribute. Cost items lower down the hierarchy affect those higher up and so on. Once the cost structure is defined, when you add products to an agreement, this cost structure is implemented in each of them, thus calculating the selling prices using the agreed method. This is one of the many powerful features of Macenta. Like all number attributes, resource item attributes can also be used in cost item formulas. What's different about them, however, is that you must select resource items for each product so that Macenta knows which attribute value to use in the price calculation. We call this process configuring the products because it's the resource items which distinguish one product from another. This is similar to how a bill of material works in ERP systems, except it's optimized for sourcing. Let me give you an example. Remember that Natasha defined 2 items for the resin resource, ABS and nylon. When you assign ABS to product A and nylon to product B, you're doing 2 things. First, you're configuring the product. You're saying that A is made with ABS and B is made with nylon. And you're also telling Macenta which resin to use in the pricing calculation. All will be clearer once Natasha demonstrates how it works, coming up next.
In this demo, I'll show you how to include resource attributes in your cost structure formulas, and then configure the products using resource items so that the selling price can be calculated. Starting off from the proposal menu, click Cost Structure in the Agreement section. When the menu loads, you can see that I've already created two cost items. The first one should calculate the molding cost, and the second should calculate the resin cost. Since these two are at the top level, Macenta will add these two together to calculate the total product cost. I say should, because I haven't yet built the formula to do that yet. Let's do that together now. Click the first cost item and then click Formula under the Configuration section. The formula for the molding cost is the machine rate times the cycle time divided by the number of cavities. We want the result to be in dollars per each. Click the plus icon in the formula header. When the dialog loads, you will see the list of all the number attributes that have been defined for this agreement, including those attributes for the resources we created earlier. You can also see two agreement attributes that I also added which convert between the seconds and hours, and grams and kilograms, which we'll be using in a sec. But for now, I'll select the machine rate attribute from the molding machine resource and then click the Select button to add it to the formula. Then I'll select and add the cycle time attribute from the mold resource. And then change the operator to multiply. Notice that Macenta has calculated the unit of measure for these two formula items from the attributes units, but it's wrong because the cycle time is in seconds, and the machine rate is in hours. To convert from hours to seconds, I'll divide by the conversion factor which I pointed out earlier. Looks better now that the units are corrected. But there's one more problem: the price is per cycle, not per each. To fix that, we need to divide by the number of cavities in the mold. Select and add the cavity attribute from the mold resource, and set the operator to divide. Okay, looks good. The unit is dollars per each, which is what we want. Closing out of this form, let's build the formula now for the second cost item, the material cost. The formula for the material cost is the cost of the resin times the shot weight divided by the number of cavities. Again, we want the final result to be in dollars per each, matching the molding cost so that Macenta can add them together. Again, click the Add button, then select and add the resin cost attribute from the resin resource. Then select and add the shot weight attribute from the mold, and change the operator to multiply. Again, you'll notice that the unit of measure for the resin is in kilograms, but the shot weight is in grams. To fix this, I'll divide by our predefined conversion from grams to kilograms. Now that the conversion is fixed, to get the price per each, we need to divide by the number of cavities again. Select and add the cavity attribute from the mold resource, and change the operator to divide. Looks good. The units of measure has been calculated as dollars per each. Now that we're done defining our cost structure, let's implement it in the products. I'll close out of this form and click Product Costs in the Agreement section of the proposal menu. When the product cost menu loads, you'll see that I've already added the housing from Saturn, Thailand to the agreement, but it's showing a warning indicating that Macenta was unable to calculate the product cost. This is because we haven't yet configured it. Let's do that now. Click the housing. Notice that two product cost items have already been added. This is because I set them both to mandatory. Let's work on the molding cost first. Click that cost item now. When the dialog loads, I'll first tidy up the name and description. Now that that's done, you'll see that Macenta is waiting for you to select the machine to mold the part and the mold to use. For the housing, I'll choose the 160-ton Engel machine and then set the mold. Next, click the resin cost. When the dialog loads, I'll again tidy up the name and description. And then select ABS for the resin grade and the same mold. Looks good. Notice that the price of the product is 0.67 cents, which has been calculated according to the terms of the agreement's cost structure and the resource items that we've selected. Now that the price has been calculated, we're ready to submit this proposal for approval, but before we do that, we'll need to update the legal text to include the resources that we added earlier. But first, some theory from William. Bye for now.
Thanks, Natasha. Since resources play such a central role in agreements, you may need to incorporate them in your legal text. Where you include them depends on your lawyer's preferences, but there are two good reasons why you'd probably want to locate them in the schedules or appendices sections of your agreements. Firstly, it's good practice to separate facts from obligations. Resources contain specifications and technical facts, so locating them outside the body of the agreement avoids your lawyers having to keep track of all changes in specifications for which the technical people are responsible. Secondly, to improve the readability of your legal text. Resource information is invariably verbose and usually takes the form of long tabular listings. You probably won't want them in the main body of the contract, cluttering up the agreement. Obviously, the scope or binding nature of your resource schedules depends on the way it is referred to in the obligatory language of the main agreement. Just attaching them without explaining to which part of the price calculations they refer to or which provisions apply may not subject your price calculation methodology to those resources. It's also a good idea to include a table of schedules in the main agreement, usually after the table of contents or underneath the signature block. In this table, you should identify the resource appendix by a number or letter. Okay, back to Natasha for a demo.
Thanks, William. In this demo, I'll show you how to create a schedule of the resources in the legal text of the agreement, using Macenta's templating language. Starting off from the proposal main menu, click Legal Text in the Agreement section. When the form loads, you'll notice that I left the template section empty, so we have a clean slate. I won't be writing the text for the body of the agreement. Instead, I'll only focus on an appendices section containing a listing of the resources used in the agreement. Before we get started, let me orient you on the tabs just in case this is the first time that you've been here. Clicking over to the Data tab, you can see that it is automatically generated from our agreement's data, so there's nothing to do here. Moving over to the Style tab. In preparation for this demo, I pasted in some CSS earlier so that the document will be nicely styled when we view it later. Back to the template. Before we get started, I'll quickly add a predefined function which converts an attribute specification into human-readable text. You'll see it in action later. You won't have to worry about this for much longer, because in future, we will introduce global functions and styles, which you can use without adding explicitly. Now that that's done, I'll scroll it out of the way so you can see what I'm doing. First, let's create a header for the appendices, and also a subheading for the resource appendix. Notice that I'm using Markdown formatting because it's quicker, but you can also use HTML directly if you're more technically minded and need more control. Now we want to loop through each of the resources. To do that, we use a for loop, and I'll also close it off with an end statement so I don't forget later. Then each time it loops, I'll output the resource name in a new subheading. I'm using a property called the forIndex, which is just a counter for each loop. But since it starts from 0, I'll add 1. So the numbering will be 1.1, 1.2, etc. Then I'll print the resources description. Okay, now since each resource has attributes, I'll provide a listing now. To do this, I'll add a nested for loop which loops through each attribute. A nested loop means that it runs inside the main loop. Again, I'm closing it with an end statement, so I won't forget later. For each of the attributes, I'll print its name in bold text, along with its description, and the human-readable form of its specification using the humanize function we added earlier. Finally, I'll print the help text. Okay, that's the attributes done. The last thing we'll do is print a listing of the items. First, I'll print some introductory text, explaining what they are. And then another nested for loop. But first let me give myself more room. On each loop, I'll print the item's name in bold, and its description. And then its attribute values. This time, I'll list their values in a table, along with the unit of measure. Right, that's it. Let's see how it looks. Click the View tab to render the results. You can see all the resources that we created earlier, along with its attributes and items. For each item, you can see the attributes value. The beauty of templating your legal text is that this list will be automatically updated when changes are made. That completes the last demonstration for this tutorial. I'll say my goodbyes now and hand you back to William.
Thanks, Natasha. Since we've just covered using resources in your agreements, I think now is an opportune moment to talk about what happens when we delete entire resources or their attributes and items individually. Since resources and their dependents are used in many places, you obviously need to be very careful when removing resources. When you remove a resource, Mesenta also automatically removes all its attributes and items. What you need to be concerned with here is where those child entities are used. Let's talk about each of these in turn. First, attributes. If you remove an attribute, then its attribute values are automatically removed. Any formulas that use that attribute will also be automatically removed. The entire cost structure of your agreement may also be affected due to its hierarchical nature. By definition, this will also affect your product costs. This is why attribute maintenance requires administrator access in Mesenta. Removing a resource item, on the other hand, is far less risky because it only affects the products that rely on that item for its configuration. When this happens, those products will simply be reset and you will have to choose another resource item. On that note, we've reached the end of the tutorial. Thank you for your attention and congratulations for staying until the end. Before you sign off, I'd like to give you a quick recap of the topics we covered in this session. We kicked off by introducing resources and the role they play in allowing your agreements to refer to external elements and in product configuration and costing. In the first half of the tutorial, I showed how resources are defined using the name, description, and type fields and through attributes. I explained the difference between resources and their physical implementation, the resource items. Natasha followed up by showing you where resources are located on the proposal menu and how to maintain the list of predefined resource types. She then created the molding machine, mold and resin resources along with their attributes and items needed for a fictitious injection parts agreement. In the second half, I concentrated on how resources are used in agreements. First, their attributes can be used in your agreement's cost structure, and their items allow you to configure and cost your products. Natasha followed up by building the formulas to calculate the fabrication and material costs of the molded parts. Then she configured and costed one of the products. The second area where resources are used is in your legal text. I discussed various strategies for including the resource information in your text. Natasha showed how to create an appendix section for the resources we created earlier using Macenta's templating language. Finally, I concluded the tutorial by explaining the pitfalls when deleting resources and their attributes and items. We certainly covered a lot of material, but by now you should be able to start defining and using resources in your agreements. Don't hesitate to reach out to us at support@macenta.com if anything is still unclear or you need any help. Goodbye.